Everyone, welcome back to the FAI Wire. It's been a while since we did a video. It's been mostly tweets and articles lately as I've been focusing on other things, but had some interactions with a friend of ours and an expert in the Middle East region, Seth Frantzman. Those of you who follow us on Twitter/X, whatever you call it, probably know Seth. You've seen us retweet some of his content. You've seen us post some of his articles and had some interactions with him. Seth, thank you for coming on to the interview today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So for those of you that aren't familiar with Seth, from what little I know about him, he's very accomplished, both academic and a journalist. He's been writing profusely for many years, has written a couple books, I believe one on drone warfare that came out more recently. The book that I'm more familiar with is about the Middle East after ISIS. I believe it was called After ISIS. Just talking about, there's a lot of talk these days about what's the day after in Gaza. And that was kind of the topic of his book, is what's the day after in the Middle East, at Syria and Iraq and the broader region after the dismantling of the ISIS caliphate. So I'd highly encourage you to check out that book if you haven't already. Otherwise, Seth, I believe, lives in Israel with his family. We've interacted with him. Our paths have crossed several times throughout the years. Seth, I believe you spent some time in the KRG in Iraqi Kurdistan during the years of the ISIS caliphate, while FAI also had some teams on the ground there. And obviously now we have teams in the Northern Galilee and Golan Heights. So our paths continue to cross, and we thought it'd be cool to check back in with you and get your take on some of the things that we see happening in not only Israel's war with Hamas in the Gaza Strip, but also the broader conflict that we see unfolding right now on the northern front, the Lebanese and Syrian borders, and also the wider implications if we zoom out across the region. How do we see other actors, Qatar, Iran, and Turkey, feeding into this conflict? So again, thanks again, Seth, for joining us. My first question is, we'll kind of zoom in on Gaza for starters. We're about 8.5 months into this conflict now, since October 7th. We've seen, I just saw today that the Israeli war cabinet has dissolved after Benny Gantz's resignation last week. So things could kind of shake up and change a little bit moving forward. We'll see how much impact that has. But so far over the last few months, we've seen it may not have been a shift internally, but it definitely from a public perspective, it seems like there was kind of a shift in the doctrine of fighting this war. In the beginning, we had 400,000 reservists, IDF reservists called up, went into northern Gaza, and I'd say that the public was under the impression, at least, that there was going to be this effort to clear and hold territory in the Gaza Strip. Whether or not that's what the IDF or the Israeli government was communicating is different, but that was the impression that a lot of us got as we were watching this war. And then it seems like there was kind of a shift, especially after the Netzarim corridor was taken, that bisects the Gaza Strip in the middle. The IDF still holds that territory and is ostensibly preventing militants from crossing back into northern Gaza, although as we know already, there are still many militants remaining in Gaza, both Hamas and Islamic Jihad. There have been several operations in Gaza City and other places to root them out, but of course they return afterwards. So there's been a debate, and I've seen different sides of this debate about what is the best way to prosecute this war in Gaza. Do we go in heavy and create forward operating bases all over the place and try to hold territory? And then there's the other side of that says, no, you don't want to do that. We've learned the hard lessons of of American coin, American counterintelligence, counterinsurgency, which is that doesn't work. And you just kind of go in with these kind of surgical operations and take out the bad guys whenever they pop their heads out of the ground. And otherwise, you just kind of let things lie until you hold the borders, you hold the, whatever the strategic points are, but you don't necessarily try to clear and hold territory. Over the long term, it's too expensive, it's too costly, so on and so forth. So those are the two sides of the debate that we've seen, and I've seen some of your reaction to that on social media, but would like you to kind of speak to what you see happening in Gaza right now, where the implications of it is degrading Hamas by 50% and preventing it from conducting another October 7th really a winning strategy, or really an effective strategy, or else what do you see as an effective strategy in the conundrum that is Gaza?
Well, there's a lot of questions. Yeah, that's right. There's a lot going on in Gaza. I think that we are not always privy to what the plans were in the beginning, and we don't always know why things may have changed, or if they just were always intended to change. So let's lay out what we do kind of know. We know that, on October 7th, Hamas attacked. They crossed the border with thousands of guys, including a bunch of civilians and other terrorist groups. And Hamas at that time had something like 30,000 or 24,000 fighters or terrorists plus, and they were divided into like 24 battalions or something in Gaza. Israel had obviously dismissed this threat prior to that. And then Israel decided after October 7th, obviously, that, Hamas had to be destroyed or defeated, whatever the word is people would like to use. Some Israeli officials said there won't be Hamas when this is over. So it was always unclear what the actual goal is. But nevertheless, the campaign began with a very large bombing campaign. And it took time to get all the troops on the line. And I think we already understood back then that Israel was going to fight a very systematic and probably slow conflict. Because if you want to fight a quick conflict, when the enemy attacks and invades your country, you have to immediately respond and attack them. Just like, for instance, after Pearl Harbor, the United States decided to carry out the Doolittle raid on Japan, right, to show that, listen, this is not acceptable. We're going to hit back as fast as possible, even if it's kind of symbolic. But I think that's just how wars generally are fought. And if you're not serious about fighting a war, then you end up doing what the French did in 1940, which is what was called the phony war, where they declared war on Germany when Germany went into Poland. And then the French and the British had to move the expeditionary force over to France. And everyone just sat on the border. And the Germans, of course, decided that how they will carry out the blitzkrieg. So Israel decided to sit, and then Israel decided to go in heavy in Gaza. Obviously, much more than it had gone in ever before. I mean, because obviously this was not going to be another 2009 attack. Israel went in, they were very quick to divide northern Gaza from southern Gaza, and then they were very quick to go into most of northern Gaza and kind of grind it down and defeat more than half of what the Hamas strength apparently was. However, as we all then saw in December, January, was that the IDF began to leave most of these areas. It's not clear if that was partly because of U.S. pressure and the question to kind of reduce the intensity, or if in fact the Israeli, officials basically said, listen, we don't want to run Gaza. It's not in our interests. And I suspect there was a conversation to be had in which the Israeli officials said, we don't really want to replace Hamas with the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank because the Palestinian Authority is also anti-Israel. So I think we have to imagine that Israel went into this war without having a clear strategy or, let's say, having leadership that agreed on what they wanted to do. It's very hard to wage a war in which people in charge don't all agree on what they're doing. Or where the army, look, armies don't make good policymakers necessarily. The armies are very good at being given a mission, right? We saw this, by the way, you mentioned Iraq and Syria. Syria is an example where the United States Army had a mission to defeat ISIS, but there was no diplomatic solution to eastern Syria, and that's why the U.S. helped to defeat ISIS, but it never bothered to recreate a political arrangement in Syria that helps the people America was working with, which are mostly the Kurdish and other fighters. So I think we noticed when you have a successful campaign like the Iraqis did in Mosul against ISIS, your political and military strategy have to go together, right? You can't just have one and not the other.
Mm.
And Israel went into Gaza. I don't think
Yeah.
there is a clear political strategy. There is a military strategy or tactic. The military tactic has defeated Hamas, but Israel was expected to defeat Hamas. It's a much stronger army. You can always defeat the terrorists on a
Mm-hmm.
one-to-one battle because you can bring the tanks and the planes, artificial intelligence, drones, all sorts of stuff. The terrorist brings the
Mm-hmm.
RPG and the AK-47. I mean, to be honest, the Hamas terrorist is fighting with a lot of the same technology the Viet Cong were fighting with in Vietnam. I mean,
Yeah.
so, in the end of the day, the question is, okay, Hamas is going to keep recruiting. They're going to keep sending young men to fight. They've shown in the past they're very good at returning to whatever they were. They've always rebuilt themselves within a few months or a few years. So the
Yeah.
question is, if Israel's goal was just to reduce the capabilities, in the end of the day, the second that Israel leaves a place, Hamas begins to rebuild. So my sense is that
Um,
if the goal is just to kind of grind them down, they will regrow. Israel could have chosen to
mm-hmm.
replace them, or at least replace them in some
Mm-hmm.
areas. And I mean, I think that when we talk about these two strategies, one strategy is you just kill people every once in a while, high-profile targets or whatever, when they quote pop their heads out. That's the strategy for fighting an endless war. There's no evidence
Yeah.
that you ever win. You just manage the conflict. Now, if your goal is to manage, fine. If your goal is to win, that's certainly not it. Now, if you are of the opinion that it's impossible to run and control Gaza, it's not in Israel's interest to run it, then you get to this catch-22 in which there's no good answer to this. And I think Israel, unfortunately, is it's at that catch-22 cul-de-sac where there is no clear answer and no one wants to do one or the other.
Yeah. Follow up to that, I just saw survey last weekend that showed as of last month, I think it's something like 70% of Palestinians in the West Bank still support Hamas in control of Gaza and would probably vote at that percentage in those numbers for Hamas in the West Bank if open elections were held anytime soon. So to your point, I guess that is the conundrum that Israel finds itself in is, well, what do you do? Obviously, long-term military occupation isn't an option. Doesn't seem like we have good options in the West Bank, unless maybe you can speak to one. That all kinds of ideas have been thrown around. What about some kind of UN force? But we've seen how that goes in Lebanon. They've talked about what about some kind of like Arab coalition. Turkey has offered to occupy the Gaza Strip, and Israel respectfully declined that offer. So, there's been all kinds of options bantied around. What are your thoughts about the feasibility of any of those? Or is it just this sort of conundrum that's not going to be solved anytime soon? And the IDF just has to keep, as you said, managing the conflict in the time being.
Well, I mean, my sense is that the Palestinian Authority doesn't function that well, but it functions a lot better than Hamas. I mean, the Palestinian Authority doesn't build rockets. It doesn't have RPGs. It doesn't build tunnels, as far as we know.
Mm-hmm.
It's not pro-Israel. Okay, yeah, they give money to prisoners that are terrorists. They do all sorts of things that are not good. But
Mm-hmm.
I think October 7th probably should have been a wake-up call. You
Mm-hmm.
shouldn't live next to a terrorist organization that's capable of killing 1,000 of your people in one day, which is one of the worst terrorist attacks in history, the worst mass killing of Jews since the Holocaust. I mean, why would you want those people on your border? I mean, it's like saying, well, we could choose the Nazis on one border, or we could
Mm-hmm.
just have like a country that kind of doesn't really like us. Yeah, okay, it's preferable to have the people that just don't like you than like the people that are willing to genocide you. So my sense is that the Palestinian Authority is a much better option, and it's actually been a perfectly good option in the West Bank. So,
Mm-hmm.
but I know that Israel's leadership they don't agree. I mean, they obviously think the Palestinian Authority is an existential threat to the state of Israel because the Palestinian state is an existential threat. That's what they think. And they
Yeah.
don't. They think that if a Palestinian state arises in the West Bank and Gaza, that will eventually become an existential threat to Israel. Now, considering what happened to Gaza after 2005 when Israel left, Gaza did become almost an
Hmm.
existential threat. I mean, and the same thing happened in Lebanon. Israel left Lebanon, and look at Hezbollah. I mean, Hezbollah is a serious military force. It's maybe one of the stronger armies in the region. So
Hmm.
it's a huge problem. Again, I would
Yeah.
say if I have to choose between Hezbollah and Hamas and the Palestinian Authority is better. However, there is a dark
Yeah.
side here, which is that the Palestinian Authority will one day be taken over by Hamas, and then you are stuck with a fait
Mm.
accompli of the worst possible people
Yeah.
in charge of Gaza and in charge of the West Bank. And then what do you do? Then what do you do? Then you're stuck with the worst type. So obviously, it would seem to be in Israel's interest to not have that happen. And
Yeah.
at the moment, the Palestinian Authority is being weakened by Hamas, as you just noted. They have a lot of support, and then so does Islamic Jihad and all these other groups, by the way, that are very active in the northern and West Bank. They have a lot of weapons, and it's
Yeah.
important for Israel to cut down on all the illegal weapons flowing there. I mean, we're talking about a lot of illegal firearms.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. I just saw Joe Truzman published an infographic the other day that showed um, weapons coming into the West Bank. I think it was since like 2022, which is when things kind of started to heat up there a lot more. And it's kind of, it was staggering. I did not expect the numbers to be that high. And obviously, a lot of that has to do with these sort of land caravans that in the Shia Crescent that Iran has been able to establish through Lebanon and through Jordan to get weapons into the West Bank. Um, so speaking of northern Israel, that was kind of, we zoom out a little bit, look at the wider conflict across the country. Um, Different scenario, but obviously related in that we've got this simmering conflict with Hezbollah that began just a couple days after October 7th with the first rocket fire into northern Israel from southern Lebanon, which is um, Hezbollah-held territory. And just for our viewers to make a distinction, Hezbollah is a political party and a militia in the state of Lebanon. So it's not technically the ruling authority in the country of Lebanon. You could make an argument that it is the most powerful political and military entity in Lebanon, and a lot of people would make that case. It's mostly concentrated in the southern Shia majority region of Lebanon. It's been a party in Lebanon since the Lebanese Civil War in the early 80s. I think in 1980 is when they were established. And they are so Hamas is a Sunni jihadist organization that has different benefactors throughout the region, Turkey, Qatar, um, individual private Arab donors in different countries, and Iran obviously is its biggest donor. But Iran is Shia, Hamas is Sunni. They work together because they're working together against a common enemy. Hezbollah, on the other hand, is a Shia organization. So you could say like a direct, not an adopted child, but like a biological child, so to speak, of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. Um, Bigger in terms, I think the standing forces, the last numbers I saw was about the same, about 24, 25,000 active militia members with reserves beyond that. But in terms of weaponry, money, gear, and equipment, much more capable, and Seth maybe can speak to that, than Hamas, especially in terms of their rocket and missile arsenal and their capabilities, which now we're beginning to see them use more and more capabilities that maybe we didn't even know they had previously. And So the saying that you'll commonly hear about a war with Hezbollah is, it was hundreds of rockets a day with Hamas, it'll be thousands of rockets a day with Hezbollah. And the concern is that an all-out war with Hezbollah could result in just completely overwhelming Israeli air defenses, And then that would force the IDF to be much more aggressive in prosecuting a war against Hezbollah in order to knock it out quickly. They wouldn't be able to wait, which of course affects, international opinion and all that kind of thing. So um, as of right now, I think it's something like 1,000 rockets have been fired from southern Lebanon and even some from Syria and UAVs into northern Israel, drones, I should say. Um, Something like I've seen anywhere between 70,000 to 100,000 civilians in northern Israel evacuated south of an evacuation line. Um, and that's just kind of the reality that Israelis in northern Israel have lived with for almost 8 months now. And many of them are getting to the point where they've had enough and they want the government to do something. So, and it looks like maybe this conflict is escalating to the point where there will be the war that we're expecting. So, Seth, can you speak to that? Does it look like we're getting close to conflict in the north, to all-out conflict? How do you think that will go, and what do you think the priorities are for Israel in that conflict?
Um, let's start with Hezbollah. I mean, it's an incredibly powerful organization. It's smart, sophisticated. It has a lot of weapons, as you said, not just missiles and rockets, but precision guided missiles and the precision guided drones, kamikaze drones, as well as
Mm-hmm.
anti tank missiles. So when we look at the arsenal they have, it's much more complex than Hamas.
Mm-hmm.
What that
Yeah.
means is that they carry out a lot of attacks in the north. They target IDF military bases. They think a lot about what they're going to hit.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, every time they target a base, it sets off
Mm-hmm.
sirens around it.
Yeah.
So Israel did choose in the beginning to evacuate 80,000 people because Israel was afraid
Mm-hmm.
that there might be a Hamas-style attack by Hezbollah. So they wanted to move the people away. That created a new equation in the north in which Hezbollah was basically given a carte blanche or a blank check to do whatever it wants because Israel is focused on Gaza, which, by the way, that would never have been possible a year ago. If Hezbollah fired one rocket, that would mean a conflict. And Israel basically
Mm-hmm.
gave up deterring Hezbollah, which I think is a serious problem. So Hezbollah has launched 5,000 projectiles into Israel. That includes, as I said, unguided rockets as well as drones and anti-tank missiles.
Mm-hmm.
They've damaged thousands of homes in northern Israel. Around
Mm-hmm.
50,000 people or more evacuated. So the whole border is a ghost town.
Yeah.
That's not a bad deal for the army because the army can operate where they want. Now they don't have to worry that they're intermixing with civilians. They're there, but it's not a good message to your citizens. I mean, to say, okay, every time a mafia cartel terrorist group fires rockets over the border, well, just evacuate, the equivalent of what in America would be basically, half of Texas or something. I mean,
Yeah.
you can't run a country like that. If you're
Mm-hmm.
willing to evacuate a whole part of your country, then you don't control the country, right? So
Yeah.
it's not a way to run a country. Now, Israel has decided it was the best temporary solution. Now people would like to go home. The Israeli leadership keeps saying that, okay, we're going to solve this. But there doesn't seem to be a clear solution because Hezbollah has basically said we have a right to attack Israel as long as the war in Gaza continues. Now, let's say the war in Gaza stops tomorrow. Hezbollah might stop attacks,
Mm-hmm.
but the Hezbollah capability will still be there. So
Yeah.
the people in Israel are not going to want to go home
Mm-hmm.
if the Hezbollah army is sitting on the border. And this is a really serious terrorist army with a lot of weaponry.
Yeah.
Now, the concern is that if Israel launches a larger campaign into Lebanon, like let's say with ground forces, it
Mm-hmm.
would trigger a much larger conflict in which, as you said, thousands of rockets will be fired every day. I think everyone now maybe understands that the Hezbollah threat is not exactly the 1,000 rockets, because actually 1,000 unguided rockets tend to not do that much damage. Rockets
Yeah.
don't win wars. If rockets won wars, by the way, no
Mm-hmm.
one would invest in F-35s, would they? They just buy rockets.
Yeah.
Rockets don't. Rockets are like artillery. No, you never win a war with artillery and rockets.
Yeah.
What wins wars is the other stuff Hezbollah has, which is the
Mm-hmm.
drones and the precision guidance and all this other stuff. So Hezbollah's real threat now is that it could rain down precision guided munitions on northern Israel, and that
Hmm.
it has Hezbollah thinks that might overwhelm Israel's missile defenses because a missile defense only has X amount of interceptors. Then you have to replace the interceptor package. Even if you have
Yeah.
laser air defenses, by the way, are not a magic wand. Lasers
Yeah.
actually are relatively slow. You have
Yeah.
to burn each missile, so you don't have that. Even if Israel deployed it is going to deploy laser air defenses. You're not going to deploy thousands of them. You deploy a few, and they basically help you. So
Hmm.
the problem is that Hezbollah's theory is that it will basically use the precision attacks after launching large numbers of rockets that kind of overwhelm the system to use the precision attacks to go in and strike the sensitive sites in the north, which is whatever it might be, surveillance or the headquarters of various bases and stuff. And this is not a secret, by the way. I mean, Hezbollah has basically openly done this already. It just does it on a
Yeah.
small scale.
Yeah.
That's look, in the end of the day, Israel's facing a sophisticated enemy that basically has the kind of technology that is approaching a modern army, meaning precision weaponry, blah, blah, blah. The kind of thing the United States used in 1991 to
Hmm.
destroy Saddam Hussein's Soviet supplied army and basically pick it apart in about, I don't know, 20 days or something. And then after that, Saddam's army basically collapsed because it was a bunch of guys in trenches and all of its
Yeah.
command and control and all of the high tech stuff, the Soviet stuff, then even I think French supplied air defenses have been just totally ripped apart.
Yeah.
This is what modern war looks like, and that's the war that Israel is. Hezbollah is not Germany or France. It's not quite a modern military. It's
Yeah.
approaching it. It's approaching it. And by the way, a country like Israel cannot afford to suffer a setback on the battlefield like that. It cannot afford to have sensitive sites like the airport be put out of
Hmm.
action. Right? Israel's not a third world country. It can't accept that. And we already saw on October 7th that even a low tech enemy riding motorcycles can apparently overwhelm, one of the foremost military powers in the world, which is Israel.
Yeah.
So if the enemy on motorcycles can do that, then we have a problem. But that's like 9/11 type of problems. I mean, you can't always
Yeah.
defend against everything.
Yeah. And to your point earlier, October 7th taught the Israelis and the world that you can't live with a jihadist organization that's sworn to your destruction on your border.
Nope.
Um, and Hezbollah is all of that and much more in terms of size and capability. And it has a lot more, Hamas, hopefully at some point, will be isolated completely in the Gaza Strip. Maybe they are even now, um, since the IDF has taken control of the Philadelphia corridor along the Egyptian border. So to whatever point Hamas can be contained in Gaza, that's not the case or going to be the case necessarily with Hezbollah and southern Lebanon. They've got all kinds of supply routes in and out of the country, and so they're in Syria, they're in the northern Golan Heights on the Syrian side. Uh, they've got access to pretty much all of Lebanon. Obviously, the IDF is hitting Hezbollah sites all over the country. And they've got this massive supply line that runs all the way back to Tehran. Um, so how do you think the IDF would approach that kind of conflict with Hezbollah? And maybe, if you feel comfortable talking about this, what do you think the international reaction is going to be to that? How will Americans like me here in Northern California be affected by an all-out war between Israel and Hezbollah and southern Lebanon?
Well, that's a good question because I think that actually, in some ways, Hezbollah is not as popular as Hamas, and let me try to explain it. It's kind of complicated. So Hezbollah is a Shiite terrorist group or whatever you'd like to call it, militant, whatever. It's based on the Shiite minority in Lebanon. The
Mm-hmm.
Shiites are a minority group. They're also Shiites in Iraq, in some other countries, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan. And of course Iran is a Shiite country as well, and that explains, of course, partly the Iranian support for Hezbollah because Iran is run by a Shiite theological, extremist group, and they support Hezbollah, which is an extremist group, etc., etc. However, that being said, the rest of Lebanon is not Shiites; it's Sunnis and Christians.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of Lebanon doesn't really like Hezbollah, which is a lot different than
Mm-hmm.
Hamas. Hamas
Hmm.
is, as you noted, of course, a Sunni jihadist group, but it's primarily a Palestinian nationalist
Hmm.
religious extremist group. So
Hmm.
Hamas gains support in the West primarily because people support the Palestinians, and they have
Hmm.
been tricked. They have been tricked into supporting Hamas because the average
Hmm.
person who supports the Palestinians, if you ask them a year ago, do you support massacring a bunch of people at a music festival and kidnapping children and old people? There, no one in their right mind,
Hmm.
basically no one, would ever support that.
Hmm.
It's only after October
Hmm.
7th that you get a bunch of crazy people in the West who are like, oh, yeah, that's
Hmm.
resistance. And obviously, it's not resistance to kill a bunch of people at a music festival, right? We all know
Yeah.
this. So Hamas has been incredibly successful, obviously, with foreign support and lots of foreign money and lots of other
Hmm.
dirty, let's say things that go on behind the scenes.
Hmm.
Hezbollah, I think, has actually a much harder road ahead of it and a hill to climb because Hezbollah doesn't have a lot of support abroad. Most people don't really know what Hezbollah is. They don't really get up in the morning and know about Iran and the Shiites and stuff. Of course, they
Hmm.
have sympathy. Of course, they have sympathy for Lebanon and Lebanese. So, to the extent to which the war harms Lebanese people, especially Christians,
Hmm.
for instance, that will
Yeah.
be seen as awful. Now, let's
Yeah.
remember, most of southern Lebanon is Shiite, and some of them are Christians and other
Mhm.
groups.
Yeah.
Most of the people along the border in Lebanon already fled. I just read a report at BBC about a small Christian village there. They said
Hmm.
of 900 people, 800 of them already left. They left on like
Yeah.
October 8th, just like Israel did. So
Hmm.
now that being said, everyone is very sympathetic to those Christians there, but those people are already out of harm's way. So they're not going to get
Hmm.
killed in the subsequent war. The people
Yeah.
that will be killed is primarily Hezbollah because the most of
Hmm.
the civilians have already left. I don't
Hmm.
think there's a lot of sympathy in the West for Hezbollah. There is sympathy for Palestinians because for obvious
Yeah.
reasons. And Hamas, by the way, is different than Hezbollah. Hamas always dressed in civilian clothes, like you and I, basically.
Hmm.
Hezbollah, in it to its credit, even though it's a bad group, they usually wear uniforms, and the Hezbollah guys
Hmm.
pride themselves on being an army. And
Yeah.
they like to act as if they're an army, even though they're not.
Yeah.
That works in
Hmm.
Israel's favor because Israel would be able to fight an actual armed force. And that's easier and better
Hmm.
for Israel than having to target Hamas, which hides in tunnels
Hmm.
underneath hospitals. I mean, by the way, Hezbollah can't hide underneath hospitals because how many hospitals are there in southern Lebanon? Most of southern Lebanon is rural and villages. Okay, so it's much harder for Hezbollah to
Yeah.
hide underneath the civilians.
Yeah.
Hamas, by the way, is lucky in this respect. It literally has 2 million human shields. Hezbollah has, like
Yeah.
2,000 human shields. Now Hezbollah in Beirut is able to hide into Beirut, and if Israel, of course, probably Israel would bomb them in Beirut, in the Dakhia, in that area that where the Hezbollah headquarters is. That whole area
Hmm.
is festooned with Hezbollah. that
Yeah.
would not look that would not look good in Israel's perspective, and there will be an international outcry. And let's remember that lots of countries like France, who are European countries, have interests in Lebanon that transcend Lebanon. I mean, France is
Hmm.
considered, was the colonial power. France has
Yeah.
a deep and abiding connection to Lebanon for Christian, for Catholic, for historic, for cultural reasons.
Hmm.
France would be outraged by an Israeli war there, and
Hmm.
obviously Israel would then face censure at the Security Council to UN, in which
Hmm.
Israel is already facing like 1,000 different complaints to the UN as well. So
Yeah.
it would have
Right.
to it would have to add to it. I don't
And
think
a
anyone
genocide
wants.
trial.
Yeah, no one wants a war in Lebanon. If
Yeah.
Israel was able to expand the war just a little bit and contain it, I think maybe people would be okay with it. Again, it's a question is whether Iran would allow that without Iran then carrying out more attacks on Israel. And Iran has threatened to jump in if Israel goes
Yeah.
into Lebanon, right? So that's kind of
Yeah.
where we are.
Yeah. So to your point, Lebanon is a different animal. We're not talking about 2 million people cloistered in a highly urban strip of land. there's more places for them to go. Many of them have already evacuated. It's a different country altogether, and it's not, and they're not Palestinians. This isn't about, occupying Palestinian land. This would be about a conflict between two powers. And to your point, um, we saw last week, I think I even retweeted this on X, a popular Maronite Christian politician in Lebanon announcing that he is working to raise a militia, which this is not necessarily good news for Lebanon that already went through a really disastrous civil war, but he's working to raise a militia of Sunnis and Christians and Druze that would potentially confront Hezbollah in the event of any kind of conflict with Israel. So there's the civil aspect of this in Lebanon that has been the case, for centuries, going all the way back to the Ottoman era, where you've got so many different types of diverse religious and ethnic groups in a nation state, and the colonial aspect of it too, as you mentioned with France and kind of overseeing Lebanon. You've got the Lebanese economic situation, which is completely in the tank. So all of those things, I'm sure you would agree factor into this, and maybe you can speak to that as well.
Um, just so I understand your question, can you repeat it again so I fully get it?
Yeah, how would you say the internal division in Lebanese politics,
Yeah,
society,
right,
and the economic situation, kind of maybe adding fuel to the fire? How do those all
right.
bear down on this conflict?
Right. Well, that's a good point. I think that actually what we're seeing there is that, again, that is a reason that Hezbollah may not want to go to war because Lebanon is already a failed, walking towards becoming a failed state, and also because Hezbollah has a responsibility for that and does not want to be on the outs or isolated afterward.
Yeah,
Hezbollah is a phenomenon like the banks back in the day when the mortgages collapsed and the banks were considered, quote, too big to fail. Hezbollah is a
yeah,
bit too big to fail. So Hezbollah, I think, cannot risk a sectarian war in Lebanon against the Christians or others. And it
hmm
doesn't want them to take advantage of that war. Because if Hezbollah is weakened, then other forces in Lebanon may say, okay, they're weak. There's a vacuum. Let's jump into the vacuum. So I think Hezbollah has to tread carefully here. But I do think that we've seen how Hezbollah has successfully taken over Lebanon bit by bit by bit, like a salami
yeah,
politics over
yeah,
the last 20 years, right? I mean, Hezbollah has really it's taken over. Basically, it's the ability to elect the president, even though the president's a Christian, but Hezbollah has a role
yeah,
there. They have
yeah,
hijacked the political system. They've hijacked the economy. They do all sorts of deals behind the scenes where they are able to kind of run parts of Lebanon on their own. Like they have a
yeah,
role at the airport and other areas. They create a state
yeah.
within a state. So you know,
The explosion
it
at the
goes both
port,
ways.
a couple of years
Yeah,
ago. Yeah,
right, exactly. Hezbollah. So right. So Hezbollah. I just think that sectarian politics are complicated. Lebanon's an incredibly complicated country, and
yeah,
Hezbollah has to tread carefully. It does not want to destabilize Lebanon, even though it wants to use Lebanon as a base against Israel.
yeah. Excellent point. Okay, so last of all, we'll kind of zoom out across the region here. And you wrote, or you published, I should say, an article recently where you kind of compared the dynamics in the region between Hamas and the other, Palestinian militant organizations to The Godfather. And for those of you that haven't seen The Godfather, you should watch it. But if you haven't seen it, I'll just explain the analogy really quick, and then Seth, you can speak to it as um, uh, Don Corleone at the beginning of the movie is approached by this guy named Virgil Sollozzo who wants to, have Don Corleone's influence and get his help so that he can sell drugs on the street. And Don Corleone, being kind of the nominal moral guy that he is, doesn't want his influence or his territory being used to sell drugs, and so he turns Sollozzo down. And then there's an assassination attempt against Don Corleone, and it's just assumed for a big chunk of the movie, the first act or so of the movie, that was Sollozzo, and directly it was. But as you find out later in the movie, there's this kind of meeting of the five families, the commission as they called it, And Don Corleone, who survives and is able to attend that meeting and tries to make the peace with all the families at that meeting, kind of figures out or discerns throughout the course of that meeting, it wasn't really um, Sollozzo or his benefactor. I think Philip Tattaglia was his name, but it was really the kind of Don in the shadows. It was Don Barzini, this kind of other big rival that was acting like he wanted to be the peacemaker, but really was behind the scenes the whole time, orchestrating all of these moves against the Corleone family. So, so now that I kind of set that up for you, Seth, maybe explain how you believe that analogy works for the conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and who the Don Barzinis are in the region.
Well, great. Well, thank you. So I think, we generally are given this very, let's say, more simplistic view of the war that's going on, which is that, Hamas is a terrorist organization. They carried out this October 7th attack. It's a really bad attack. Israel is now fighting a war against Hamas. In my view, that's not what's going on. Yes, Hamas carried out the attack. Yes, Hamas did most of the killing. But there's no way, in my view, that this massive attack could have taken place without massive foreign support. And we can compare this to any other example in history, that seems where you have to suspend disbelief, like 9/11. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
9/11 was 19 hijackers or something, right? It's true, it was the hijackers. But in the end of the day, Bin Laden was behind it. But who was behind Bin Laden? Bin Laden where was he living? He was in Afghanistan. Who
Mm-hmm.
supported the Taliban who were backing Bin Laden?
Mm-hmm.
Pakistan. Where was Bin
Mm-hmm.
Laden found in 2011? Next to the Abbottabad military complex in Pakistan, which is their
Next to
version
the
of
West
West
Point
Point.
of Pakistan. Yeah.
Yeah, so let's be honest. I mean, a lot of the financing for Al Qaeda didn't just come from there; it also came from the Gulf and other places. I think it took about 10 years for the United States to wake up to all that and basically cut down on all that, and get the Gulf countries to crack down and stuff as well. So when we look at Hamas, we have to ask key questions here. And I've always said that throughout the war, we will eventually get to a Don Barzini moment where we all wake up collectively and we say, wait a sec, who's really behind the scenes here? So,
Mm-hmm.
and you said it's not just one; it's a bunch of foreign powers. And I think let's look at the players here. After October 7th, where were the Hamas leaders living, and where did they celebrate on October 7th? They were living in Doha in Qatar. Qatar has hosted Hamas leaders since 2012. Oddly
Mm-hmm.
enough, it was apparently the United States government during the Obama administration that said that was a good idea.
Yeah.
Why was it a good idea? I don't know. It's like the people that thought the Taliban moving to
Mm-hmm.
Qatar was a great idea as well. And then the Taliban
Yeah.
took over Afghanistan. And you have to ask yourself, why did American boys die in Afghanistan for 20 years so that the Taliban could come back being
Mm-hmm.
hosted by a U.S. ally, Qatar? It doesn't make a lot of
Yeah.
sense, does it? So first of all, we have the Hamas leaders in Doha. They're some of the examples of people that are obviously not directly in Gaza, but are clearly behind this. Then you have the fact that Turkey is openly backing and hosting Hamas. Turkey has basically since October 8th, been saying, very, very harsh and critical of Israel. They've compared Israel to Nazis, whatever, et cetera, et cetera. So Turkey's another player whose role is certainly problematic here. I think them in Qatar, and then the Russians. The Russians are basically allies of Iran. Iran backs Hamas. The Russians have hosted Hamas. They have not condemned October 7th. I mean, so we've got the Russians involved as well. Now, did the
Mm-hmm.
Russians know about October 7th? Yes, we don't know. Yes or no, we don't know. Russia has intelligence assets, right? They have their equivalent of the CIA and NSA and stuff like that, right? Is it really plausible that Hamas planned the largest attack, a terrorist attack, one of the largest ones in human history,
Mm-hmm.
killing more Jews than any time since the Holocaust? And there's not
Yeah.
one other country, no, not one country in the Middle East knew this. How's it? Either all those countries should replace their intelligence services, or they knew,
Yeah.
some of them knew about it and they didn't say anything because they thought we'll benefit from this war. Because look,
Yeah.
who benefits from October 7th? Well, okay, let's do the math. Israel does not benefit. Israel's in a much worse position today.
Mm-hmm.
Do Gazans benefit? No, Gazans do not benefit. Do
Yeah.
Palestinians benefit? Not so much. Do the
Mm-hmm.
Lebanese benefit? We just talked about Lebanon. Lebanese do not benefit.
Mm-hmm.
Hezbollah benefits. Iran benefits. Russia benefits. Turkey
Mm-hmm.
benefits.
Yep.
Apparently, Doha benefits. So when we begin to ask who benefits, apparently China as well, by the way, is somehow involved because China is looking to broker a Hamas Fatah deal about the West Bank and
Yeah.
maybe bring in Hamas like a wolf in sheep's clothing into the West Bank,
Yeah.
which again, that's the Don Barzini factor because what is the real goal behind October 7th? The real
Hmm.
goal is not just to kill Jews. That's, of course, one of the very bad goals.
Hmm.
Just like the shooting of the Godfather was not just about the Godfather, right? It's about money. It's about the families. It's about a whole bunch of other things. October 7th's goal is to bring Hamas into power in the West Bank. The whole
Hmm.
goal there is to position Hamas to basically get Hamas out of Gaza and move them to the West Bank. And I would say that when you look at the players here who are lining up behind Hamas after October 7th, all of those players want to basically work with or use Hamas to bring it to power. And they
Yeah.
see Hamas as part of a wider global war against the West because Hamas is anti-Western. The
Hmm.
Palestinian Authority is supported by the West, even though the Palestinian Authority is not very good, but they're supported by the West.
Yeah.
So the goal of countries like Russia is to use this as part of the global war against the West and to weaken the West and weaken Israel. And Israel is a key component of Western strategy and to
Yeah.
break up the Abraham Accords and weaken the Western strategy of stabilization in the region. So when we
Hmm.
start to look, I think when we start to look at the big picture, we start to see yes, a lot of moments in which we start to say, oh, what's really going on here? And then I think we have
Yeah.
to. And this is not a conspiracy because most of what I said are just this is just a fact. I mean, it's just a fact that Turkey hosts Hamas. It's just a
Yep.
fact. Now, when you start to say, did they know? Then you might run into questions of conspiracies and things. I don't know if they knew. I'm saying, ask yourself a question: is it plausible that no one knew? My sense is someone did know, and they didn't stop it because they thought, you know what, we'll benefit from this, and that's
Yeah.
that's my that's my theory about this whole thing, and I think we will get to a scene in our own movie in a sense, since our own all lives and all wars are also a three-part, Shakespearean tragedy. We'll get to a scene. We'll get to our own scene in our own Godfather, in which maybe it will be revealed what the really larger story here is, and then hopefully we're not in a place where we can't confront it, because obviously in The Godfather they understood it and they eventually confronted it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and to your point, and I think you even, I think I even saw you retweet this, but there was last week, there was a kind of a bombshell report that Unit 8200, which is Israel Signals Intelligence Unit, the ITF, actually their entire signals intelligence system went down. I think it was like something like 7 hours
Yeah,
before the October 7th attack began. Um, Now, was that technical failure that was just highly coincidental? Was it cyber warfare, which obviously wouldn't have been conducted by Hamas? That would have been a state actor, a state player at work there. We don't know yet. But like you said, in the U.S., we had the 9/11 Commission, which for better or worse helped us to see a lot of, there's still parts of that commission report that are redacted related to Saudi Arabia, even to this day, but gave us a much better picture of a broader perspective of what happened on 9/11. Um, Perhaps at some point we have some kind of similar study that's done where we can kind of link the pieces together and, like you said, have our Barzani moment with this conflict. And then I guess that the next question would be, what do we do? Michael Corleone just took everybody out at the end of the movie. I'm assuming Israel isn't going to, take out all the heads of state of Turkey and Qatar and Iran. And so then what becomes, if we see the extent to which those nations were culpable in October 7th and even complicit and actively participating in it, as there's some evidence they might have been, they certainly weren't surprised by it, as you mentioned, then what's the next step?
right. I mean, this is it. This is the $1 million question. I mean,
Hmm.
Israel's not in a place, obviously, to go after all these countries. I mean, Israel is in a place to maybe make some small inroads, like try to get the Qataris to not have these guys there in Qatar. But again, that would require probably the United States to agree to that. I mean, again, it's a huge problem. Obviously, it would be better for Israel to work with the West and say, listen, the Russians are part of this. Let's work against them.
Hmm.
I think that Israel has a serious uphill battle. You mentioned 9/11. I mean, you're right. After 9/11, no one wanted to go after the Gulf states or some of the states that may have played some or known something. I mean, it was easier to go in Afghanistan because Afghanistan was anyway a failed state. Then the United States went into Iraq. I mean, which was
Yeah.
a questionable why. So, I mean, I
Hmm.
support, of course, destroying Saddam Hussein. I like the Kurds. I'm just saying that it was not clear what the connection there was.
Yeah.
I would compare, the Israel faces the same problem, apparently, the dilemma of the
Hmm.
issue of the pandemic and COVID, which is we don't necessarily want to know, or let's say our governments have not wanted to know, how did this thing start?
Hmm.
Did it start in a lab? And
Hmm.
what did the people know when it began that allowed it to
Yeah.
run around the world and destroy most of our lives for like
Hmm.
2 years? And we've seen the
Yeah.
pushback against Congress and other people trying to investigate the origins of the pandemic. So unfortunately, when you have world changing events, I think there's a preference sometimes to narrowly tailor your definition and your who's guilty,
Hmm. Yeah.
and try to find that a more easy
Hmm.
explanation that is like those people are clearly bad.
Hmm.
What did these other people know? Maybe, but are they guilty? I mean, if you know something bad is going to happen and you don't do anything about it, you're obviously not as guilty as the person who perpetrates it. But it
Yeah.
doesn't mean that you're a good person either. So I think that
Yeah.
that's where
There's
we are.
complicity. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so we don't
Yeah.
know. I do think we'll find out a bit more. I mean, you just mentioned this story of the 8200. I mean, how is it plausible that an entire key communication spying system goes down for like the 6 key hours before a massive event? I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
that would be like if before Pearl Harbor, all the communication systems stopped working or something like totally
Yeah.
bizarre like that. I mean,
Radar and everything
you'd
went down. Yeah.
you'd have to assume that saboteurs were involved. I mean,
Yeah.
but again, sometimes people can connect A and B and C and come up with some sort of conspiracy that is perhaps a bit too much. So you don't
Yeah.
always want to imagine everything is like that, but because sometimes mistakes just line up, and then it's just a tragedy.
Yeah. 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 Well, and to your point, at least raises the question, and there's a thread to pull on there. Um, okay, excellent. Well, we're coming up on the end of our time, so thanks again for joining us. I just have one more question for you. Um, so we have a lot of followers here at FAI that are very interested in Middle Eastern geopolitics and want to know what's going on and want to know how they can be supportive of especially our initiatives in Israel and the Middle East, but also just be supporting the region, the broader region for good. So they want to know how they can pray. They want to know how they can give. They want to know how they can occupy the space they live in, whether that's through political advocacy or whatever it may be. So, what would be some of your suggestions for the best ways for our wider FAI family to engage with the region, to be advocates for what you believe to be the good causes right now, and turn what they're learning into something actionable in their daily lives?
Well, I mean, of course, you should support Israel and confront any of these extremists you're seeing. If you see these anti-Israel protests or this type of stuff, I mean, it's important, I think, to physically confront it. Of course, legally, physically, but I mean, you're allowed to counter protest. So I think that's important. I mean, to show Jews and stuff in America that support Israel, and if their synagogues are being graffitied or whatever, that's something you can do
Yeah.
locally. I think in terms of doing more than that is, obviously it's one thing when people can give money or support or what have you
Hmm.
to the communities around Gaza that have been affected or in the north. But I think
Hmm.
physically coming to Israel, whether it's on a trip or a mission or whatever, a pilgrimage, to come and then be in the country, spend time and resources with tour guides and stuff. People are out of work now for basically a year
Yeah.
because of this stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, that's incredibly important to keep
Yeah.
coming to the country to show that the country's not isolated, And then, in the wider region, I think to support other friends of our, we mentioned the Kurds and other people that are part of our Western or pro-American or pro-Western, what have you, groups. So that because we don't want the Middle East to be taken over by these Iranian-backed groups and terrorists and stuff. So all
Yeah.
of that, I think, is super important to be keyed into that larger picture.
Yeah. Yeah. To a couple of your points there. So after the last Israeli military operation in Gaza, which was Protective Edge, I think in 2014, I just went to my local synagogue here in California and just got to know, I knew some of them already from school and in other places, but, I just spent some time with them and got to know them and helped them out with some projects around and just talked to them and built relationships with my local Jewish community. So I think, yes, absolutely, that's something important for us to do wherever we are, is if you have a local Jewish community that you can connect with and see how they feel that you can be supportive of them, then do that. And also, I just got back from, I was in Israel a couple months ago for a film shoot. It wasn't a tour, but that was my first time back since the war started, and it felt very, very different. I don't know how, the last 8 months have felt for you living there, but just coming back after about a year with the war in between is just a very different feeling. And I was just really thankful to be there to spend some time with Israeli people. And, obviously there's not a lot of tourism there right now. And, but overall, I mean, it was safe while I was there, and we ate a lot of good food and spent a lot of time with some good Israelis and made some new friends. And so I would definitely encourage people, if you can muster up a little bit of confidence and courage, to go over, and the money, that you go over for a week or two and spend some time there. So yeah, I think that's great advice. And anything else, Seth, you want to get off your chest before we let you go?
No, that's all good.
Yeah,
Perfect.
awesome. Well, thank you again very much for joining us. We're looking forward to posting this interview and getting some interaction with our followers. Hope to talk to you again soon, and God bless you. Take care.
Thank you. God bless. Bye.